Our session 2 will be consist of 3 talks on the subject of Black lives and botanical illustration. But just before we start with the first one, I just wanted to remind some housekeeping items just for the people who weren't with us this morning. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box rather than in the chat. It's easier to monitor all the questions when they're in the one place. If you would like to ask your question directly, you can do so. You can just raise your hand, and Padma, our event and comms manager, who's in the background, will make you a speaker, and you can ask your question in that way. And I think that's about us. Just to say you're welcome to tweet. I see some people have already done so, and thank you. And I think that's it. So a very warm welcome to the speakers of this session. And there are 2 talks on John Tyley, which I'm delighted about. And we start with Jnese William. I'm sorry, I probably completely pronounce your name wrong, but don't take offense because I'm used to it. Usually people pronounce mine wrong. It's from University of Notre Dame, John Tyley and the Limits of Scientific Authority in the Anglo-Caribbean, circa 1800. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I will go ahead and try and share my screen. All right, there we are. So it's Janice. That was a very good try, Janice Williams. I wanted to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me to participate, and thank you, the audience, for coming to hear us today. And I apologize in advance because compared to many of the presentations you'll see today, my PowerPoint is pretty image poor, but I'm sure there will be plenty more beautiful botanical illustrations in the other presentations moving forward. John Tyley was a man of color who worked as a botanical artist in the St. Vincent Botanic Garden beginning in about 1794. He served as the assistant to Alexander Anderson, who had risen to be the superintendent of the St. Vincent Garden about 9 years prior in 1785. This garden had existed for 20 years already, but Anderson's arrival was a turning point when the British government in London decided to fund the garden and appoint Anderson as superintendent with the idea that he would seek out valuable plants for medicine, agriculture, and industry that might help improve imperial finances. And so I think this audience, of all audiences, would know how important plants were for empires at this time. European populations had developed a taste for specific plant products like spices and sugar and chocolate, and many European powers tried to get a piece of the trade in economically important plants, and this could include finding ways to grow them on colonial territory. Empires were also all eager to discover new medicines and maintain their supplies of known remedies. And so to that end, in the late 18th century, British officials established gardens in the colonies to pursue these goals, along with agricultural development more generally. The St. Vincent Garden, where Anderson and later Tyley worked, was one of these. The government's need for agents with botanical skill created an opportunity for men who were interested in botany, but needed to work for a living. And so Alexander Anderson was one of these men. He had been a hospital mate in military service who came to the notice of the right people to gain his appointment as superintendent at St. Vincent. The empire's demand for valuable plants also meant the incorporation of even more marginalized people into the production of botanical knowledge. And this includes botanical artists in India, enslaved people, convicts, free people of color. Usually these groups went unnamed, but occasionally someone like Tyley appears in the archive. So today I want to use the experiences of Anderson and Tyley to explore how men of marginal social status could navigate botanical circles of their time. How did they convince more elite botanical enthusiasts that they had knowledge or skill? And secondly, I want to look at Anderson and Tyley's lives in the context of the local society of St. Vincent. What did their botanical knowledge or skill mean to the people around them? What structures of the local society enabled or limited them? Episodes in Anderson's and Tyley's lives show how perceived botanical expertise could destabilize but not efface social class, both within and outside the Botanic Garden gates. And so first I will focus on Alexander Anderson's clash with the governor of St. Vincent when he arrived to take his post as superintendent in 1785. Anderson forms an interesting point of comparison for the second person I will speak of, and who's really the man of the hour, John Tyley, whose status as an educated person of color made colonial officials uneasy. These accounts show that skill in the colonies could be valuable, but it was inseparable from the social status of its bearer. So let's begin with Alexander Anderson. Anderson owed his appointment to the St. Vincent Botanic Garden to Sir Joseph Banks, who was important for British botany in this period, as many of you know. He was wealthy and politically well-connected, head of the Royal Society, the preeminent learned society in Britain, and scientific advisor to the royal family. And so Banks had helped the royal family turn their private garden at Kew into one of the most impressive royal botanic gardens in Europe. As a man from the upper classes, people were already inclined to take his words as disinterested and authoritative, so he had scientific authority sort of built into his social identity. So in 1785, Banks encouraged government to financially support the St. Vincent Garden, and he and the Secretary of State for War would serve as a London-based advisory team for the enterprise. In doing this, Banks created an opportunity for a would-be naturalist who could not fund his own travels. And so that would be Alexander Anderson. Anderson was already in the Caribbean, working in a hospital on St. Lucia. He was a correspondent of William Forsyth, who was important in London's botanical community. Anderson came to Banks' attention through plant exchanges through a botanist in St. Lucia. Anderson's connection to botanical circles in the Caribbean and London helped him to win the post of superintendent of the newly reestablished St. Vincent Garden with Joseph Banks's blessing. Anderson would find, though, that gaining local support outside of the botanical community was much more difficult. Like most colonial superintendents, Anderson had no social standing to rely on if issues arose with high-status locals. Little is known of Anderson's past. Since the office of superintendent was new, there was no authority already established or embedded in the title. He had to convince locals that he deserved the power invested in him by his government orders. In St. Vincent, the governor of the island, Governor Lincoln, had received War Office orders that Anderson was coming, but he refused to give Anderson possession of the garden right away. Anderson arrived on the island to find Governor Lincoln's relatives living in the superintendent's house, and Lincoln's cattle and grazing animals were rooting through the garden. The superintendent took action, calling upon his elite connections in Britain. He complained to the War Office and finally gained possession of the superintendent's house. He fenced off a dirt path to keep the governor's enslaved workers from driving the cattle through the garden. Governor Lincoln was furious, and angry letters were exchanged between the two men. Anderson confessed to a friend that one of his letters that he had sent had really been too bold a letter to send to a governor. Though Anderson had the backing of influential people in Britain, there were bounds of civility that he needed to observe. Class differences and the honor that was due to men of consequence were foremost in the governor's mind when writing about the impasse between himself and Anderson. Lincoln wrote to Anderson regarding two heated meetings they'd had and called the judgment of others into the matter, saying, "The gentlemen who were present at the conversation on both days declared that I had behaved with unmerited moderation to you." Lincoln continued, "Your present conduct is equally indelicate to me, both in my public character and private station." The governor had received orders about Anderson's appointment, but he was not prepared for a man like Anderson to insist on these orders being followed to the letter. The bickering went on for months, but eventually matters improved. According to Anderson's own history of the St. Vincent Garden, his relationship with Governor Lincoln became friendlier after the Secretary of War laid down the law. Anderson excused his report of the earlier unpleasant period in his history of the garden with the following: I wish to point out to men in elevated situations the impropriety to attempt opposition to science or useful institutions, and that they will gain more credit to themselves and merit more the approbation of their sovereign by countenancing and supporting them. So Lincoln may have been the representative of His Majesty's government, but Anderson was a representative of science, and he was confident that the court of opinion would fall to the side of the poor naturalist laboring in a botanic garden. Anderson's expertise as a naturalist brought him to the attention of men like Banks, and his knowledge and their connections made it possible for him to contradict his local social betters without losing his position. Lincoln and Anderson learned to work together, namely after the orders clarified the situation of the garden and in turn the nature of their relationship. Anderson's botanical expertise had made his class identity somewhat ambiguous. Lincoln was not prepared to have someone of Anderson's stature contradict his will, but eventually both parties figured out a way of relating that was acceptable to each other. And the relative peace that followed allowed Anderson to get to work in the garden and hire an assistant. But a string of unsuccessful assistants led him to complain about the scarcity of good workers. He told the Secretary of War of his difficulties in 1793. He wrote, I have been much distressed for want of an assistant. All the white men I can get here soon become inattentive and cannot be trusted by reason of the bad company they associate with and a habit of drinking they soon acquire. Anderson's difficulties created an opportunity for a young man of color, John Tyley, who is the subject of the rest of this talk. After complaining about his speckless white assistants, Anderson wrote to the Secretary at War that he had found a mulatto assistant from Antigua with good character and a tolerable education. The next year, Anderson wrote to William Forsythe about Tyley's real talent. Tyley had lived with him for the last year and was making drawings of all the new species they could find. Anderson lamented his inabilities to serve as Tyley's patron. Anderson wrote, I wish he may have encouragement in proportion to his merits, and I think it is a pity such talent should be buried in this part of the world, and I wish my finances would afford to take him out of obscurity. Anderson thought Tyley might make a good assistant to a gentleman who wished to travel and study natural history, and he asked Forsythe what kind of opportunities might exist for Tyley in England. Anderson also sent some of Tyley's drawings to Forsythe, perhaps as an advertisement. So as Anderson himself had been supported by Joseph Banks and others who recognized his skill in botany, he wanted to serve the same role for Tyley. However, he did not envision Tyley as an independent naturalist, but only as an assistant. Tyley's skill set him apart, but even Anderson, whose knowledge had helped give him some independence, he could not imagine that Tyley would have these same sort of chances. And Tyley's position was remarkable, but it was not uncommon for people of color to serve as botanical artists in the colonial gardens. It was uncommon, though, that Tyley was individually credited for his work. Botanical drawings were incredibly important. They documented plant features and helped local botanists keep track of the plants they had named or identified. Images were easy to send to botanists in Europe, who could then compare the images with the floras and herbarium specimens to which they had access. And Anderson used Tyley's drawings in this way. He sent drawings to Banks in London, who would then write back with identifications for the plants with which he was familiar. Botanical drawings also provided an avenue for advertising the work done by naturalists in the colonies. Anderson used Tyley's drawings to advocate for the garden, sending them to the Secretary at War. No matter how Anderson used them, Tyley's drawings could advertise his own skill because he signed some of them, and he had Anderson as his patron, vouching for his ability. Tyley's credited drawings were a very visible sign of his expertise. Though Anderson wasn't wealthy, he was a devoted patron to John Tyley. He fought for salary increases for him. Tyley had wine with the Anderson family after dinner, and he met Anderson's visiting relatives. When Anderson's nephew visited, both Tyley and Anderson gave him drawings to take back to New York and get engraved, which might result in further exposure for John Tyley. Though Tyley's talent made him valuable in the St. Vincent Garden, it could not protect him from expulsion from the island when he made the authorities uneasy. He was understandably not satisfied with the status quo for people of color, so he began to advocate for change. In 1800, Tyley was found by the government to have carried on a correspondence with like-minded people of color on Martinique and Antigua that was very improper and perhaps seditious and grossly abusive of the white inhabitants of the West Indies. The exact nature of all the letters is unknown, or at least to me. Tyley was tipped off. He received a warning that his home would be searched, and he was able to tear up his letters and scatter them among the sugarcane contiguous to his residence before the search party arrived. Authorities were particularly nervous about uprisings of free people of color. The revolution in Haiti and other resistance movements had led British officials to suspect additional plots amongst the free Black population across the West Indies. And there were efforts to restrict their movement, and colonial governments became more vigilant in their search for signs of unrest. When Tyley's correspondence was discovered, the president of the Assembly in St. Vincent wrote to other British possessions in the Caribbean to warn them of possible unrest. Tyley's foray into activism cost him his job at the Botanic Garden. He was tried and found guilty of seditious libel, exiled from St. Vincent, and sent to the president of the council in Barbados, since one of his most enthusiastic correspondents lived there. Even had Tyley been found innocent, though, the president of the St. Vincent Assembly, with the support of the Home Secretary, stated that he would not have supported reinstating Tyley at the Garden. Both men were anxious to preserve a distinction of color between the inhabitants of the British colonies. Both men saw Tyley as a threat to that distinction, presumably due to his status as a skilled government worker and a man of color. So Tyley's activism cost him his job. He was expelled from St. Vincent and returned to Antigua. And this is where historians of empire leave Tyley's story. I have found, though, that despite his conviction for sedition, John Tyley's expertise earned him an opportunity to work as an independent naturalist. In 1802, George Hibbert and John Woodford in Britain wrote to the governor of Trinidad to ask for Tyley's safe passage to the island. These two men were well connected in elite botanical circles in Britain. They called Tyley an experienced naturalist and draftsman and planned to support him for a year or two to explore the plant life of Trinidad. Hibbert and Woodford felt that Tyley's mission would have public benefit in the exchange of plants, and they asked for government support in the form of free passage and rations, as though he were a junior officer in the military. This plan was an extraordinary development because Hibbert, at least, probably knew about Tyley's past. The Hibbert family owned a West India trading house, and his uncle had made a fortune as a planter in Jamaica. Hibbert's brother lived in Jamaica and corresponded with Alexander Anderson. Anderson himself was in Trinidad collecting plants when Hibbert wanted to send Tyley there. It stands to reason that Hibbert and Woodford knew of Tyley through Hibbert's brother in Jamaica or through Anderson directly. It's possible that Anderson was continuing to serve as Tyley's patron and perhaps intended to be reunited with him to collect plants together on Trinidad. But even if Hibbert did not know of Tyley's past, he must have been aware of the racial dynamics of the British Caribbean. His family's fortune was made from plantations and the slave trade, and he was an impassioned defender of the institution once he entered Parliament in 1806. He had never been to Jamaica, but he was involved in institutions to protect the West India interest. And once it became clear that slavery would be phased out, Hibbert threw his support on the side of compensation. As someone disconnected to the institution of slavery, it's really difficult to believe that Hibbert did not know that a man like Tyley was destabilizing to the status quo of British West Indian society. Tyley's chance to become a naturalist in his own right demonstrates how valuable botanical knowledge could be in the right place. It seems that Anderson stood by Tyley and served as his patron, vouching for his skill to Hibbert and Woodford. Perhaps they had also seen some of Tyley's drawings. On the strength of this support, Hibbert and Woodford called Tyley a gentleman in their letter, and they referred to him as Mr. Tyley. People familiar with local plants and European modes of botany were thin on the ground in the Caribbean, and perhaps the scarcity may have led Hibbert and Woodford to overlook the threat that Tyley could pose to the social order. Though Hibbert and Woodford in London were possibly aware but unconcerned about Tyley's past expulsion from St. Vincent for sedition, Governor Picton on site in Trinidad was concerned. Picton was notoriously autocratic and eager to keep the racial balance in a colony where free people of color outnumbered white settlers. In his response to the passport request, he outlined Tyley's seditious actions of 1800 and noted that everyone in Trinidad was aware of Tyley's character. People of color saw him as a champion and a martyr in their cause. Allowing Tyley to roam freely on Trinidad would be a threat to the island's social order. News of Tyley's botanical expertise had traveled to London through Anderson's intercession, perhaps, but news of his political activism had traveled across the Caribbean. Picton denied the passport request and scuttled Tyley's chance to become a paid naturalist. And the details of Tyley's life after the failure of his plan to send him to Trinidad are pretty sparse, or at least to me, but he continued to find supporters in the region who recognized the value of his skill. In 1815, Dr. Hamilton in Antigua wrote to Sir Joseph Banks about him. Hamilton praised Tyley's skill as a botanical artist and rued the system of the most ingeniously cruel persecution which had driven him from St. Vincent. Perhaps to convince Tyley of his own veracity, Hamilton enclosed a drawing that Tyley had given him. Again, Tyley's drawings continued to be an advertisement. As further support, Hamilton named others who knew of Tyley, which included current and former governors and governors' wives of Trinidad and Barbados, not Governor Picton, though. Incredibly, 15 years after losing his job in the St. Vincent Garden, Tyley still had people in power who presumably knew about his political sentiments, but continued their connection to him, presumably due to his artistic abilities and knowledge of plants. Though his political engagement had cost him dearly, Tyley never gave up hopes for improving the lot of people of color in the Caribbean. He was a signatory on an 1823 petition from Antigua's free people of color for a royal commission to investigate the administration of justice. In the 1790s, Anderson had sought more opportunities for Tyley, but he never saw the artist as more than assistant. And yet, Tyley found patrons willing to finance him as a naturalist in his own right. The value of his perceived knowledge and skills allowed him to step outside of the usual boundaries for someone of his race, but outside the botanical community, he had to contend with the profound limitations that were placed on free people of color. Tyley was unable to travel, but the drawings he made for Anderson found their way to London. After Anderson's death, his executors passed them to the Linnean Society. In the published issue of the Society's transactions, which announced the donation, Tyley is not mentioned at all. His work became a part of his patron's legacy, perhaps until this conference. So to truly decolonize the history of botany, I think we must do more than celebrate the achievements of extraordinary marginalized people who fought against the structures of their societies to enter the historical record. We must also scrutinize the modes of their exclusion and the strategies that they used to make any headway to create a more robust picture of the bonds that held botanical society together in this period, the practices of botanical work, and the meaning of botanical work in the empire. In Anderson and Tyley's cases, the continued importance of personal relationships, of elite patrons to vouch for naturalists with lower social status, gave them opportunities. Anderson was able to contradict the local governor because he had powerful friends back in Britain who valued his botanical knowledge. One might call Tyley a naturalist, in part because people above him on the social scale wanted to hire him as one. Because the support of powerful people stood in for formal qualifications, men of uncertain birth, including people of color, were able to take advantage of some opportunities in the British colonies. But the ability for botanical knowledge to open doors had its limits. In Tyley's case, paradoxically, the knowledge he was perceived to have, which earned him his government position, is precisely what made him so threatening to the social order. The colonial officials on St. Vincent and Trinidad did not dispute his skill. Tyley's knowledge and the status it earned him directly contradicted the racial distinctions that colonial government and European settlers had constructed to restrict people of color. These distinctions were a hard barrier preventing people of color from participating in botanical work as independent actors. Botanical knowledge could confer a bit of power in the empire, but it was valued unevenly, and individuals who held it, particularly people of color, was still tightly bound by the social codes of colonial society. And thank you for listening. And if there's time for questions, I would be delighted to answer them.
Thank you so much, Janice. I mean, you've like opened up so much of John Tyley's life, and I'm really delighted because I'm, as you know, we have some of his material, and it's great to know more about him. I was actually wondering whether to go straight to Julie and then take questions about John Tyley together, if that's okay, because I think that would make sense. Yeah. So yes. I think that's what we'll do. We'll leave the questions about John Tyley for both of you after Julie's talk. So Julie, if you want to come on, and Julie's will also be talking about John Tyley, representing Black humanity, John Tyley's botanical illustration. So Julie Chun Kim from Fordham University and my co-organizer of this conference. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think this is a great idea to combine the Q&A because, you know, there's really so much to talk about with John Tyley, and I wanted to thank Janice for her wonderful paper, and I'm really happy to be in dialogue with her. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you see this, Isabel?
For some reason, I can only see half.
You can only see half.
Which is very odd. I've never seen that before.
Let's see, hold on.
Oh, here we go.
Is this any better?
So you're back to the try play from start again.
Okay, let me see.
Yeah, how odd.
No, okay, you know what? I may have to, let me try disconnecting something.
Yeah, for some
right,
reason
hold on, let me try something. Because I'm connected to a monitor, so that may be what's causing the problem. Sorry, everyone.
No, that's okay.
Difficulties.
Don't worry, there's always some technical difficulties.
Okay, let me try this. Okay, what about now?
No, just try play from start again. Because what I can see is all your slides here.
But can you see the middle screen anyway? Like,
yes.
Although you can see. Okay, what about, maybe I should just go with this. It's okay if people.
Yeah.
See. Okay, let's just go with this to make it simple.
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Do you want to try one more time? If you have disconnected the monitor, it might work.
Okay, let me try one more time. What about now? Is it working?
No, I think it's not responding to when you're clicking for some reason. I think let's just go with that, Julie.
Yeah, let's just go with this. It's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So representing Black humanity, John Tyley's botanical illustrations. My first encounter with John Tyley came at the Linnean Society several years ago. I had made an appointment to look at the botanist Alexander Anderson's papers, which his family had donated to the Linnean Society in 1811, the year that Anderson died, in the hopes of memorializing his scientific work and achievements. Anderson's writings are fascinating and included not only a history of the Second Carib War, a revolutionary conflict between the Afro-Indigenous inhabitants of St. Vincent and the British, but also an extensive detailed catalog of the plants that Anderson grew in the St. Vincent Royal Botanic Garden. Anderson had served as superintendent of the garden from 1785 to 1811. What caught my attention and eye the most during that initial visit was not anything that Anderson had written, however, but what was inside a set of folders accompanying Anderson's manuscripts. When I looked into them, I saw and was stunned by what could be described as bursts of light. And I'm referring here to this illustration that Tyley did, titled Cinchona Floribunda. Perhaps not literally, but in the slightly darkened atmosphere of the reading room, the effect of opening that first folder was bordering on miraculous. What the folder contained were paintings, painting after painting of brilliantly colored tropical plants, up to 148 paintings total. These paintings were on the same slightly yellowed paper that Anderson's writings were on, but they were watercolors, which, when skillfully done, possess an inner luminosity that imbues their subjects with life.
And Julie, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but your slide hasn't changed.
Oh, really?
So I think your screen must be frozen for some reason.
Okay.
I don't think it's responding.
Maybe I need to shut it down.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll shut down PowerPoint and try reopening.
Yeah, and I think maybe if you just stop sharing and start
Right.
again, it might.
Okay.
Someone in the audience says it's because it's set to share the PowerPoint, not the slide view.
Okay, I mean, let me try to fix this. If you, can you see my PowerPoint?
Yeah, we can see your PowerPoint.
Are you seeing the slides change?
Yes, that's changing. Do you want to attempt putting it on slideshow?
I will attempt it one last time. If I can.
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect. We're on.
All right.
Well done.
Okay. So yes. So this is one of the first watercolors by Tyley that I saw, and I was saying that what really stood out to me was the way it kind of glowed in the reading room, because when watercolors are well done, they have a kind of inner luminosity, and this one clearly was done by somebody who had a lot of skill. Whoever had painted them had applied the watercolor paint in thin translucent layers so that light could still reach the relatively white ground of the paper, which reflected this light back through the paint and made the plants on the page glow. I say whoever because at this point, I had never heard of John Tyley. I did see his signature on 11 of the paintings in the folder though, and I became intrigued, perhaps even a little bit obsessed with learning who this artist was. So, and here's an example of one of the Tyley paintings with his signature, which you can see down in the lower left-hand corner here. The more I learned about Tyley, the more I realized the crucial nature of the role that he had played in the St. Vincent Royal Botanic Garden. Anderson described this role in a letter that he wrote in 1794 to William Forsyth, head of the Chelsea Physic Garden and Anderson's mentor. The relevant passage begins with Anderson's account of the status of the garden catalog, a project that Forsyth encouraged him to pursue. According to Anderson, the work on the catalog was going well because he was, quote, getting drawings of all the new species and those not well known. I have at present a considerable number and intend persisting if I can afford the expense. Even more promisingly, Anderson had been able to commission these drawings because he had finally succeeded in finding a botanical illustrator to work for him at the garden. Anderson described this illustrator, who turned out to be Tyley, as a, quote, deserving young man and a native of Antigua. He also noted that his artistic ability was a, quote, natural acquisition, he is self-taught, and that he had arrived at the garden about 12 months before in 1793. Until Tyley's arrival, there's no evidence that Anderson had made significant progress on his catalog. Once Tyley had established himself as a resident botanical illustrator, however, the project began to take off. Tyley's contribution was notable enough that colonial governor of St. Vincent, William Bentinck, wrote a letter in 1798 praising his work on the catalog and recommending that he receive a raise. Tyley and Anderson were both being paid by the British government for being employees of the garden. As Bentinck's letter argued for Tyley's merit, quote, there is a young man of color named John Tyley employed by him, meaning Anderson, who has shown great ability in delineating the different kinds of fruit and flowers produced in the Botanic Garden. He is the only person of the kind on the island, and I commend him as well deserving that sum to be doubled, for his merit as an artist is considerable, and he is extremely well spoken of by Dr. Anderson. Bentinck emphasized Anderson's evaluation of Tyley, since Anderson was the head of the garden and Tyley's supervisor. He also emphasized the contributions that Tyley was making to the Botanic Garden by painting the flowers and fruits growing in it. In spite of the considerable nature of these contributions, I want to spend the rest of my time talking less about what Tyley gave or added to Anderson's work, and more about Tyley's illustrations themselves and what they might have meant to him. Although it is of great importance to note the foundational roles that Afro-Caribbean individuals played in colonial science, thinking of what these individuals did only according to a contributorship model risks diminishing their agency, as well as the possibility that they had their own aims and motives for participating in scientific projects. Moreover, these aims and motives could diverge from or even run counter to those of the founders or directors of these projects. They could be fugitive, as Britt Russert has said, and point to Afro-Caribbean participants, quote, ongoing experiments in freedom, even within the confines of supposedly imperial endeavors. I will try to illuminate some of what Tyley may have been doing and thinking as an artist by focusing on the Tyley painting that the Linnean Society just acquired this past summer. And this is very exciting. The painting depicts a large central tree bearing green fruits, a human figure sitting underneath the tree's left side, and a sapling underneath its right. The caption at the bottom of the painting reads Artocarpus incisus, a now obsolete scientific name for the breadfruit tree. It makes sense that Tyley would have created a painting of the breadfruit tree, which is deeply tied to the history of the St. Vincent Royal Botanic Garden. Specimens of the breadfruit tree arrived at the garden in 1793 to mark the culmination of a multi-year effort by the British government to transplant breadfruit from the Pacific. This arrival was seen by the backers of the breadfruit project as a triumph, in part because it had taken so long for the project to succeed. The first attempt to bring breadfruit from Tahiti to the Caribbean had ended in failure when sailors on the Bounty, the ship carrying the breadfruit, mutinied. The ship had been captained by William Bligh, who needed a second trip on the Providence to accomplish his mission. It is easy to focus on Bligh's heroic overcoming of adversity, as so many stories about breadfruit have. There is another more sobering way to tell this story, however. The reason that the backers of the breadfruit project were willing to pay for 2 exorbitant trips around the world had to do with the desire to prop up the system of slavery. Specifically, those supporting breadfruit's transplantation believed that bringing the new foodstuff to the Caribbean would literally allow bread to grow on trees and end famine on plantations. More importantly, at least from the perspective of plantation owners, ending famine would limit the likelihood that enslaved laborers would rebel out of hunger. Breadfruit was intended to ensure a satiated and docile workforce. Ironically, however, most enslaved Africans who encountered breadfruit expressed a reluctance to eat it, let alone make it a regular part of their diets. On one occasion, Anderson wrote to Joseph Banks, the orchestrator of the breadfruit's transplantation, of reports that enslaved consumers, quote, do not like breadfruit and will not eat it if they can get anything else. Anderson included these reports primarily to deny their accuracy, but tales of aversion crop up consistently across the Caribbean. The resistance to breadfruit stemmed in large part from preference for familiar staple foods like plantain and banana, but perhaps it also came from a refusal to let slave owner whims dictate the details of everyday life. How Tyley felt about breadfruit is something we cannot know, but he most likely would have heard enslaved consumers' complaints. These complaints would have been most likely especially intense around Tyley, since Anderson forced the enslaved laborers who worked for him to consume breadfruit. One could easily imagine Anderson urging Tyley to paint it too. Tyley's depiction, however, departs significantly from the typical 18th century botanical illustration. These illustrations usually portrayed plants as singular specimens on a blank page with no background or contextualizing information included. They also generally rendered such elements as leaves, flowers, and fruits in minute detail. These choices stemmed from 18th century botanists' interest in categorizing the world's plants according to various systems of classification. These systems relied on exact descriptions or depictions of physical characteristics to differentiate species from each other. From a scientific perspective, then, portraying anything other than the plant itself was unimportant. Yet Tyley's painting includes not only a breadfruit tree, but also a human figure most likely meant to represent a person of, an enslaved person of African descent. We can surmise that the figure in the painting was depicting an enslaved individual, since many images of enslaved individuals from the period showed them laboring bare-chested and in knee-length pantaloons. Tyley's portrait is not a strictly realist one, though. First, the breadfruit tree's canopy possessed an unnaturally triangular shape. Second, the figure underneath is also aestheticized. He sits and leans back on one hand in a reclining and even leisurely position. While such a pose may not seem unusual, to depict an enslaved person resting in the 18th century Caribbean was a potentially radical act. For enslaved laborers, the reality was constant, unceasing work, especially during periods of sugarcane harvesting on plantations. The mills that ground up the cane stalks would run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to maximize the quantity and quality of sugar extracted. Tyley's subject then is notable for his stillness and quiet occupation of the space underneath the breadfruit tree. One could even argue that in taking his ease, he presents us with an image of Black life and humanity that counters the idea of enslaved people as objects to be controlled. This impression is reinforced by the fact that Tyley depicts his subject in profile. To talk about the significance of this choice, I want to turn quickly to a work of art that was not done by Tyley. This is the well-known frontispiece to Phyllis Wheatley's 1773 book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. Sitting with quill in hand and book and inkpot nearby, Wheatley is clearly in the midst of an act of poetic creation. She is also, like Tyley's subject, depicted in profile. And as she looks up and outside the oval frame surrounding her, she seems to be in the midst of an act of reflection. This too has a visual parallel in Tyley's painting, which shows the man sitting underneath the tree looking off into the distance at something that only he can see. In painting the man in this way, was Tyley trying to capture the atmosphere of the garden? Historically, gardens have been places where human beings have gone not only to cultivate plants, but also to find respite and inspiration in the company of nature. And there is evidence that Anderson designed the garden to be a contemplative space. When Anderson's nephew visited him in St. Vincent in 1799, he wrote in his diary that his uncle had named one corner of the garden the seat of the Muses. Or was Tyley possibly trying to capture something about his own position in the garden? Being free, as Tyley was different, profoundly different from being enslaved. Yet, as Olaudah Equiano acerbically asserted in his autobiographical narrative, being a free person of color was only a, quote, mockery of freedom. Is it so far-fetched that Tyley saw himself on a continuum with his subject? After all, Tyley too had found space within the garden to escape ordinary routine. The proof of this lies in his botanical illustrations, which required immense resources of concentration and time to create, resources that Tyley somehow found. As anyone who has ever tried their hand at botanical illustration will know, it is a painstaking art that requires the painter not only to pore over the minute details of plants, but also to spend hours and days rendering those details as accurately as possible. There is no way to rush botanical illustrations, which demand a high level of commitment from their creators. For instance, examining this illustration and imagining Tyley delineating the cluster of tiny white flowers at its center gives us a good sense of the precise effort he would have had to make to produce a realistic depiction. Imagining this act shows us how time must have slowed down and how the rest of the world might have disappeared for Tyley so that he could paint in miniature. Now, what I'm saying is a bit speculative, but I think we need to be to make up for the large gaps in evidence that exist for Afro-Caribbean and other marginalized subjects from the colonial period. In doing so, I'm following the lead of other scholars of the archives of slavery who have called for interdisciplinary and creative methodologies. There's also some intriguing visual evidence suggesting that Tyley himself was interested in issues of time and duration. This is a painting that Tyley did of an ornamental plant that Anderson named Cuphea melvilla. And Anderson named this after General Melville, the founder of the St. Vincent Botanic Garden. What interests me, though, is the detail of the flowers that Tyley included at the bottom of the illustration. He's chosen to represent the seeds dropping out of the flowers in almost photographic fashion. They're suspended midair as though caught in the act of falling. Perhaps time really did slow down and even stop for Tyley as he contemplated and studied plants. That Tyley could find this focus in the St. Vincent Royal Botanic Garden and in the Caribbean is worth dwelling on. The garden was not a plantation, yet it was also deeply imbricated in systems of slavery. Enslaved laborers did the vast majority of work that went on in the garden. The garden was a space of violence as much as it was a space of respite. The garden was also surrounded by plantations and other sites of discipline, punishment, and horror. The colonial Caribbean is not a place that we tend to associate with beauty or art for some very good reasons. Yet as Tyley practiced his craft, he was able to conjure up beauty in forms that still persist today. We also know that these were Tyley's creations because he took the time to sign them with his name and with his hand. To end my talk, I want to return briefly to Tyley's painting of the avocado, and particularly the signature on the painting. Is it an accident that Tyley put his signature right below a leaf that points to and highlights it? Perhaps Tyley put his signature there merely as a matter of convenience. Perhaps that's simply where it fit. But I do wonder if that is the best explanation. I think it's quite possible that Tyley really wanted to be remembered. And for that reason, it is imperative that we do so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie, for such a brilliant talk. And Janice, do you want to join us as well? Because I think your talks really complemented each other. And we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. But I just wanted to remark how striking it is with both your talks and Malini's talks this morning, how really striking it is that you can, if you start digging a little bit in the archives, you can get quite a lot of information on these artists, which I find really quite inspiring and full of hope, actually, that we can manage to finally do a little bit of giving back in a way.
So a lot of historians of slavery have done a great job of, pioneering methods of almost like valuable speculation. When you have certain details, you can sometimes triangulate and, make a few assumptions that are profitable to think about, even if we cannot prove, the exact event happened or not.
Yeah. Okay, so there are two questions in the Q&A. The first one is anything known of Tyley's family life, and what is the date of his death, please? So I guess either of you can answer to this. Maybe Janice, do you want to go first?
Sure. Despite what I have found, a lot is still unknown. But, again, with this profitable speculation, the petition that he signed, the 1823 one, there was another similar petition in 1832, which John Tyley did not sign. And so then that would imply that perhaps he had died by that point. Though other Tyleys did sign, which perhaps were family members. I don't know myself.
Okay, Julie, do you want to add anything? Or
no, I mean, I think that Janice and I have seen many of the same sources, and that they're, in spite of everything we have been able to find, which I agree is very hopeful, Isabel, that there's still really large gaps in the story. But I did want to reiterate, I don't think this should deter us from telling these stories. That, I think what scholars of slavery have really shown us is that we need to rethink some of the standards and norms that we maybe have had in the past about what constitutes evidence, and exactly what kind of evidence is needed to create a historical narrative that gives meaning to situations and to individuals.
I couldn't agree more, Julie. And I also agree with you that we should not always take the production of botanical knowledge as the endpoint, because then that ends up excluding a lot of people, where we might have a few details, like, for instance, the enslaved workers that worked in the garden. I think it's valuable to discuss how what their workflow was like, what their life was like in the garden, even if I cannot prove that an enslaved person told Alexander Anderson about a specific plant and contributed to knowledge. I feel like it's still a part of the history of science and the history of botany. And, from your talk, I can see you also agree.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much we do know from aggregated sources that I think now we have enough stories from so many different places. And yes, even if they're not all about the exact same person or situation or even geographic location, the plantation system, for example, system of slavery, those were, Caribbean white institutions. So I think we can definitely make a lot of good inferences, and I think as long as we present our conclusions honestly, that, yes, sometimes, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, this is what is likely, et cetera. I think that, that's helpful.
Okay, there's actually quite a few questions now.
Yeah,
We've only got 5 minutes.
Okay.
There's a very straightforward one from Henry. Might it be a self-portrait, which I think alludes to the figure underneath the breadfruit tree?
Yeah, it's hard to say, you know. I mean, I think what I was trying to suggest is that Tyley may have, you know, seen elements of his own experience or tried to depict elements of his own experience in the garden in that, because, you know, certainly if anybody had time to sit and think in the garden, that would be Tyley as well as Anderson, of course. You know, they would have sat together or separately in the garden working on the catalog. It's hard to say whether it's a direct self-portrait, though. I mean, I'm not an art historian, but I know that you get into really tricky issues when you try to talk about artists representing themselves. But I think the image is very evocative.
Thank you. So there's another question for you, Julie. Would you go so far as to say that in omitting botanic anatomy in his portrait of the breadfruit, he was also challenging the 18th century preoccupation with classification of the natural world? And there's a follow-up question for both of you, but I'll keep it there for the moment.
I mean, I think, you know, I think it's a really plausible speculation. I can't say that for sure, but I do think with this particular drawing, he's certainly abandoned that preoccupation. You know, he is not doing the kind of drawing that Anderson asked him and instructed him to do for the catalog. And, you know, this drawing, the origins, I think, Isabel, are a bit mysterious. We don't know exactly, you know, where it came from, what its history. I mean, that's still all stuff that needs to be researched, which is great. But yeah, we don't exactly know why Tyley did it or for whom he did it.
Okay, and then for both of you, Anna Laurent says, there's certainly a limit to viewing nature through a strictly taxonomic lens. Do you think Tyley might have agreed?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say yes, definitely. I've seen fewer of his illustrations than Julie has, but, you know, some of them I think you can tell that I don't think all of them were done with the intention of documenting all of the botanical structures. And, you know, I think some of them were done, like one is simply a grouping of fruit, which, you know, I'm not sure what the purpose of that was, but it seems like he did it just for the joy of it. And being a self-taught person, that's probably how he began, you know, depicting plants around him, was simply just for the joy of it, not for any sort of scientific purpose.
I'm going to move on to the next question, if that's okay, because it's got a few.
Yes.
You may have to type some of the answers once we get to the allotted time. Dominic says, thanks for fantastic talks. I have a question for Janice and a related one for Julie. Was there any discussion of Tyley being of mixed race and his intellectual abilities, an important topic of discussion in late 18th century scientific racism?
Anderson is definitely not, he has the prejudices of his time, and you can see that when you look at the things he wrote about enslaved people. But when it came to Tyley, he was actually, I think, very generous in describing his skills. And I sort of joke about the tolerable education thing, because in a different letter, Anderson says that like a local planter that he was friends with had a tolerable, like a white planter had a tolerable education. So I think he almost means it as a compliment and not necessarily as any type of authoritative.
So actually, Dominic says, does he provide any details on what the tolerable education Tyley received consisted of? Any prior botanical training, languages, drawing?
Not that I know of, no.
I don't know of anything that we don't, as far as we know, we don't have that information.
And so he continues, sorry, this is quite a long question. It relates to the question for Julie. Do you see a connection to the in-profile portrait, both of Tyley and Wheatley, to the practice of 18th century popular physiognomy, especially shadow drawings to highlight intellectual achievements, capacities, itself full of racist, sexist, classist assumptions?
I'll answer really quickly to say that, you know, I hadn't thought of that connection before. It's a really fascinating one to think about. I mean, I don't think, you know, yes. And, you know, clearly with the Wheatley portrait, there was something there, you know, there was some kind of evidentiary motive there, you know, to put it at the front of her book to say, yes, she really did write these poems. I think something really different is going on with the Tyley painting.
Okay. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. There's a couple of questions still to answer. Feel free to type the answers if you can, or if you would like. So thank you very much both for such great talks. And we're now going to our next speaker, who is Joy Gregory, who is an artist, and she will talk about Seeds of Empire, or Little or No Breeze.
Oh, good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I'm also going to share my screen. I'm going to talk about a new work that I've made in collaboration with the composer Philip Miller. I'm going to see if I can share my screen here. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Okay. It's an installation work, and it's come really out of my interest and research into Hans Sloane. I was introduced to Hans Sloane during my Nestor Fellowship, which is a National Endowment Fund for Technology, Science, Technology and the Arts. And I was a recipient in 2000, I think 2001, 2002, anyway. And Bob Bloomfield introduced me to the collection because I didn't really know very much about it at all. And I was also at that time very curious about my own Jamaican heritage. And my parents had an awful lot of knowledge around plants and plant use. And I was really curious as to whether or not there was some transference or some sort of like handing down of that knowledge across generations, and thought I might be able to find something of this within the journal of Hans Sloane. I spent some time going through the herbarium, which I found absolutely fascinating, and reading through Hans Sloane's journals. And also my parents took me to Jamaica, or I went to Jamaica with my parents, and I was very curious to hear more about what their friends and other people of that generation, both within the city in Kingston and within the countryside. So my parents are from Clarendon, and they both have family land out there, or did have family land out there. And different people worked on that land, and used different plants for different remedies, because they didn't tend to go much into the towns. And I mean, I think at that time I was also thinking about how I'd be able to illustrate that sort of knowledge. And so I was playing around and testing different things out, including working with cyanotype, which I had worked with previously, creating a language of flowers, which related to the work by Hannah Hatkins. In 2012, so this is sometime after I went over to Jamaica with my parents, which I think was in 92, 2013, I went out and I spent a considerable time on the island, and went around with my sister, driving around to different people that she knew and collecting, we drove around the entire island. I suppose listening to different stories about the use of plants and that sort of plant knowledge. And for me to sort of understand whether or not it was dying out, or it was just a matter of it not being transferred to the different generations within the diaspora, was particularly within the UK, which had been my own experience. And I did spend a lot of time sort of like looking through that. So like moving on quite swiftly to the present, to the very recent present. In that time, I'd actually come back to the UK, and I've been, I suppose, hanging out in the Chelsea Physic Garden. And I had been doing a lot of work in South Africa, because what I did with my Nestor Fellowship was I used it to look at endangered languages. And I think because I was spending a lot of time looking at languages that had died and disappeared, or those that were coming back, or those which were moribund, that I felt that I was actually looking outwards at other people's heritage. And I was also really interested in looking at my own heritage and the idea around loss. But I ended up joining Chelsea Physic Garden, and I think by absolute coincidence, a friend of mine from South Africa was in London, and I was had a day off work or something. I said, why don't you come meet me in the Chelsea Physic Garden? So he came and we had tea, and he was delighted to discover that the first gardener at Chelsea Physic Garden was called Philip Miller, which with the exact spelling of his own name. And he thought it was absolute fate that we should actually definitely do something together, because we've been talking about doing something, but never really thought about how we could work together on something. And then we also sort of like, you know, we spent like, this was like in 2013, 2014. We spent a lot of time going back and forth thinking about what we could do and how we could develop that. And then I think the opportunity came like in 2018 through having a conversation with Danielle Arnaud about doing something at her gallery. And I spoke to Philip about that, and he was really interested. And he happened to come back to the UK because he's actually based in Cape Town. And we thought, yeah, we'd really like to do something together, and we'd like to do something around Sloane. And so we spent a lot of time in the British Library going through Sloane's voyage to Jamaica, or voyage to the islands, and including Jamaica, and taking notes of those texts. And in the meantime, he also went to Boughton House because he was quite taken by, and this is actually through the filmmaker Adam Lowe, who was up at Boughton House, because he was quite taken by the fact that there was some of the music that Sloane referred to was actually in the collection at Boughton House, wrapped up in sugar paper, which I thought was really interesting. Anyway, we spoke to Danielle about doing a show, and yes, we were definitely going to do one, and there was definitely space for us to do it. It was supposed to be happening last year in 2020, but then of course the pandemic hit, and so like everything was postponed, or maybe postponed forever, or maybe another time. Anyway, this year she came back to me in, I think, God, in the spring, and said, look, we have a slot for you, but it's in May. And I was like, oh, right, okay. So we could do something in May, but it's actually not, it's only like a couple of months to pull everything together. And so we did manage to do something. And I think the pressure of time made that really important to do it, well, to think of something quite quickly. And so I've been thinking about sort of maybe doing it as a film, or putting a film together, and which would be like a natural thing to do if you're working with sound. But it was sort of like, well, how can we actually make this happen? Because I'm in London, and Philip is in Cape Town. Anyway, we decided that it was possible. So I started to put together images for 2 films. So thinking about it as a single installation with prints, but also with the film, and thinking about the film with 2 separate video works, with 2 separate sound works, each sound work being placed with each of those, with each work. So that the upstairs work was in talking about one thing, and with each of these, the central focus was on 2 texts, 2 short texts from Hans Sloane. So one was to do with his observations of the weather, and the other one was to do with his observations and treatment of an enslaved woman called Rose. And it's going to be very difficult to do this, but I'm going to try and show or replicate this installation through through showing clips of each of these films and the sound work. So I'm going to start off with the observations of Rose, so just a little clip of this. And they're drawn from images of Jamaica that I've collected over a long period of time. So some from like as early as when I went out with my parents in '92. And each time I went out, I collected a different thing, and they were combined with the text that Sloane wrote about Sloane wrote about Rose. So what he was doing, he was treating Rose for those quite understandable depression. And in combination with this, so the film's not, the film is silent, but I mean, like, but behind the film is the sound work. So the sound work was drawn from people's people who'd come to Jamaica from the UK, who'd come to the UK from Jamaica, and their experience of actually being here. So I'll play a little short clip of that.
Couldn't cope with the cold, found that very difficult because Mum came over here in the July, and when she came it was summer and everything, and shortly after the winter set in, and that is what she found difficult. But she did experience a bit of the British summer. Then she realised, yeah, I'm in England, London.
The first thing I noticed was the darkness. The whole place was dark. And it is so gone over. Lonely, wish I was back in Jamaica. The coldness and the loneliness. When you came over from Jamaica, you feel if you go out in that cold, you're going to catch cold. Not realizing that the fresh air was still good for you. That there wasn't any central heating or anything.
And so I'm sorry, I'm only going to share short clips of those things. We do. I mean, I do have the entirety of the. I mean, it's very difficult to show it because the film is like, I suppose, 10 minutes long or 14 minutes long, and the sound work is an hour long. So it's an installation, an immersive installation that you would experience in the upstairs room. There's a combination of two works. So it's sort of like part two, which is called Observations of a Little or No Breeze. And it brings together an image of a supposedly enslaved person with the observations of Hans Sloane, his observations of the weather, with again a sound work by Philip Miller, which is actually drawn from it's drawn from a score which he found in the archives at Orton House, which I think is called Angola or something like that. But that is the basis for the music that he created for this particular piece. And within the film, I used a mixture of still images and moving images, and black and white and color. And these were all shot in the same house that the exhibition took place, which is in Kennington. It's like a row of terrace houses that were built in the 19th century, 18th, 19th century. And the house that the work is shown in is actually called Empire House. I didn't even know it was called that until the work was actually on show. And there's sort of like three scenes within the film. So one on the staircase, one within that room, and another one at another location of a similar period of time, a similar period in terms of its building, its creation. Alongside this work, and I am going to show you the film as much of the film as I can, there's a new part of the work, or is it a separate part of the work, which is around plants of resistance. And in this case, I worked with the marginal tree and looked at how that has been used as a plant of resistance, and it was placed opposite a cotton tree, which is a tree or plant of attack, because within Jamaica, I don't know about the other islands, in some of the towns or main areas. It was a tree from which enslaved people would be hung. So it was and to use cotton paper. So I wrote this text for the machineel tree, and I will be doing something similar for the other plants that we unearth within that context. So I don't know if people can see this because it's quite small. The machineel is reported to be the world's most dangerous tree. A touch of the bark will burn the skin, while rain falling from the leaves will easily blind. The beautiful apples taste sweet as honey before warming the mouth with tremendous pain and constricting the throat to the point of asphyxiation. Plantation owners were feared of the imprisoned women who cooked their food. The rich plant-based knowledge of the enslaved was power to be used against their owners. Sally Bassett is alleged to have used the root of the machineel as an act of resistance. For this, she was burned alive at the stake. The indigenous people of the Caribbean used the sap of the machineel to poison their arrows and the toxic leaves to contaminate the water supply of invading Spaniards. So I put together those texts with that particular work to place it within the installation around Seeds of Empire. So Seeds of Empire is sort of like a catch-all title for lots of different works that Philip and I intend to work on together and separately. So the other plants it's quite interesting. We talked about the breadfruit earlier. Another plant of resistance I was looking at was that obviously the breadfruit, with the enslaved people refusing to eat that. Although, latterly it's become sort of recognized as a plant. I mean, in Jamaica, it's sort of like seen as a traditional food. And also the peacock flower, which again, as a plant of resistance, which was used as an abortifacient. So I'm going to show as much of the film as I can. I think I don't know how much time I have. Yeah, I don't have very much time, so I shall show as much of this film as I can before I run out of time. And it's, I'm just going to show these very quickly. So that's the film, and then from the film we made a print, and also we made a vinyl, or Philip put together a vinyl of the sound works as well. So so that's sort of like the big, that's our first collaboration and the first project that we've made together, but we intend to obviously do more because we made both the film and the sound piece together in I think we had like 3 weeks all in all to get it all working, and for me to do the recordings and do the interviews and then get them transferred and everything. Anyway, so I don't know if people have any questions, but yes, thank you so much. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen now. Thank
you, Joy. That was both mesmerizing and very moving. So thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you for sharing your work.
Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, please either raise your hand or put it in the Q&A. But in the meantime, could you say a little bit more about the music, actually? Because you said it came from Sloane.
Yes, so Sloane employed someone called Baptiste. So I don't know, because while Sloane was on the island of Jamaica, I don't think he had much, I don't think the person he came to work, the governor, was having much shrift with him. So he didn't really do much of his, he came over to be his personal physician. And I think he had more belief in the other physicians on the island being sort of like people working with plants and things. So he spent a lot of his time actually observing and traveling around the island and meeting with and observing plants and the enslaved people of the island. And there was people obviously came with their songs, and obviously because they had come directly from Africa, then you know, they would still have their own culture with them. It wouldn't be lost in any sort of way. And I think he Baptiste transcribed the music, but I mean, like, it's not an accurate rendition in any way, because it would have been done, I mean, like, it would have been done by European hand and European vision, whereas I mean, like, it's actually coming from another continent onto a third continent.
It does sound a bit Baroque at times, actually. So there is clearly.
Yeah, so there's lots of different lenses through which this has actually been made. And so what Philip has done, when he went to Boughton House and found all these scores, he's taken one of them and sort of like reworked it. And his ambition was actually, he was working with an Angolan singer, for them together to actually produce something else within that, with words and things. But there just was, I mean, obviously within 3 weeks, there wasn't enough time to do anything like that at all.
Yeah, what I found fascinating as well is this complete obsession with the weather on both sides, on Sloane's side, going to Jamaica, and then on the Jamaicans coming to England, and for obviously different reasons. That
was deliberate, because what I wanted to do through the weather was to also show how Sloane had cast himself as this objective observer, which of course is an impossible position to have. And then the people come. So his thing was about about observing the weather as this. You know, objective person, but also using that same voice to observe Rose and observe plants, to observe everything as this outsider. And then I think with the Jamaicans I interviewed, there were the particular questions asked about the weather, about their gardens, and about you know, sort of like their experience of being in the UK, or their parents' experience and what they remembered of their parents saying, because obviously that Windrush generation is sort of dying out, and very few people are able to come from Jamaica into the UK, was to inject the humanity into the real experience of that when you go to somewhere new.
Thank you. I see Julie has a question. Julie, do you want to come on and ask?
Hi. Yes. So, Joy, it's wonderful to meet you. And I found your presentation and your art so evocative, and such a great example of how, you know, like, looking at these documents with a kind of critical eye and an artist's eye, can turn them into something valuable, even if they're mired in colonialism and slavery, those histories. I guess I was just wondering, because I've always been fascinated by Rose's story, why you chose Rose. I mean, was there a particular reason to choose her? Because there are other stories in the Sloan too, other people that he treated, other enslaved patients.
No, but I chose Rose because it's only the beginning of the project really for us in terms of making work. And when we Philip and I were in the British Library and we were sort of like going through the journal together, that was one of the stories that actually jumped out at me. There are obviously, as you say, there are lots of other stories, and so therefore there are lots of other potential works to come out of that in terms of giving voice to different characters within that text. But I think, because that jumped out at me immediately, it stayed with me. So when we were given the opportunity to make, to actually show the work, but with very limited time to make something, and also because we were in lockdown then, so there was actually no chance of going back to the library. And we were also on different continents, so there's no chance of us either getting down, and going through the works together. And we both remembered that story, which is why I used that story. And initially I was trying to get somebody else to represent, it's not a representation of Rose, it was just sort of like a representation of an enslaved person, because it's not in the Caribbean, it's actually in the UK, because we shot it within that house. And so, I suppose using artistic light, but it was sort of like trying to represent a human experience within that sort of context, but to also bring it into present day. But the person I wanted to do it refused point blank, so I had to do it myself. So they were on the other side of the camera.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there because we need to stop for a break. But thank you so much, Joy, for coming on and sharing your work. And I think it kind of blended in really nicely with the historical talks that we had before. So thank you.
Thank you.